Welcome all to the Saphira Center of Shamanism, where we break down the ancient tech of shamanism and the occult, bringing them into balance with the deep psyche. My name is Luke, experienced practitioner and mentor of the shamanic and occult sciences. As always, it's an honor to have you here with me. Definitely check out the links within the description of this video if you have interest in joining my membership programs and working closely with me. First link for my premium membership service, the Saphira Shamanic School, and the second link for my Patreon. Check those out. I look forward to seeing you over there. So today, we're going to be discussing common mistakes that I've observed both with myself and other people that I'm mentoring as they go through the Qliphothic initiation process. The Qliphothic initiation process is one of the most powerful forms of self-evolution that one can go through. I believe it to be the most powerful form of self-evolution that one can go through. But it's highly complex and highly personal. When you enter this initiatory process, it's extremely somatic in the sense that a lot can come up within the body through body sensations, through emotions, through flashbacks, through archetypal encounters in your day-to-day life. And it can be a lot when you are in the midst of a set of initiatory trials that are orchestrated by the Qliphothic tree. As I've gone through this initiatory process myself and continue to go through it, I'm far from finished. I've observed mistakes that I have made along the way, as well as the people that I mentor. I've also observed similar mistakes in them as well. So I think it's important to discuss these common mistakes that a lot of people do end up making within the Qliphothic initiation process, as a lot of these aren't really spoken about. The Qliphoth is very much spoken about in a way within the occult community that is very edgy, and there's a lot of fear-mongering that goes on. Everybody knows, who is aware of the Qliphoth anyway, everybody knows that there is a lot of power to be gained within these Qliphothic realms, but not many people are aware of the common pitfalls and the common mistakes that is very, very easy to fall into if you're not aware of them. Okay, within the Qliphothic process, it's important to realize that it's not a punishment. So, the spirits know that you are going to make mistakes, and it's human to make mistakes through this initiatory process, okay? But the main thing, as we sort of undergo something that holds the level of psychological and energetic intensity that this particular initiatory system does, it's important that we take ownership, and it's important that we take accountability for our mistakes to avoid perpetual cycles within the Qliphothic process, as it is very common to just get stuck and end up cycling in the same stuff time and time again. So this video, we're going to be discussing the most common mistakes within the Qliphothic initiation process, which is an essential topic for anybody who is going through this initiatory process or anybody who is preparing for this initiatory process as well. Essential information and topic, so definitely stay tuned. So the Qliphothic tree is a form of daemonic metamorphosis, a pursuit of self-deification that has a particular agenda behind it. We're not just referring to realms of initiation, but you are actually engaging in the primordial agenda, which is to resurrect the primal masculine and feminine. Basically, the Qliphoth is a route of initiation that is returning you to your draconian essence. And your draconian essence basically represents who you were before you came into this physical body, who you were before all of the conditioning. So what the Qliphoth does is that it takes you through a gradual process of dissolution whereby you are dissolving your falsehood in order to reconnect with who you are underneath that falsehood. Okay, despite what everyone says, you're not dissolving your ego, you're not letting go of your ego, but you are dissolving layers of your ego. Okay, things that have been established, identity structures, personas, roles that have been basically holding your identity in place and basically creating this notion of who you think you are, but in reality, who you are is far more than what society has given you. Okay, a lot of people, well, the majority of the collective, are emanating roles, masks, and personas and identity structures that are not actually what they chose. Okay, they were sort of automatically given. Okay, we think on a societal level that we are emanating autonomy, but in reality, we are just responding by default, unless we choose to do something about it. We are just responding to predefined programs that create the illusion of sovereignty. Okay, and the Qliphothic initiation process is basically a path whereby you're committing to yourself and to your soul. You're making a commitment to actually reconnect with your truth. And when you are reconnecting with your truth, your illusions are being exposed. Okay, your illusions as to who you thought you were, as to what you thought the world was, is all going to change when you go into this Qliphothic initiation process. This is a map of your nervous system. Okay, it's a dark map of your nervous system. It basically represents the unexplored portions of your system. So with every sphere and stage of the Qliphoth that you initiate into, you are opening up part of your body. Okay, you're opening up a dormant aspect of your nervous system, and then that energy is flowing in, and it causes a transmutation process to unfold, whereby the crystallized emotions that are stuck within that portion of the nervous system then get fleshed out by basically a load of initiatory trials that are orchestrated by the energies that you've tapped into. And it all happens through resonance. You open a Qliphothic sphere, you are opening a portion of your nervous system. That energy is then radiating around your entire body. And then through resonance, you pull in resonant experiences, psychological encounters, maybe spirit encounters, physical encounters, that are going to be archetypal manifestations of the initiatory process that you are going through. So despite what many people say, the Qliphoth is very in the body. It's a very somatic process, which means that when you are opening a Qliphothic sphere, you are likely going to feel it very tangibly within your body consistently as you undergo that initiatory process. Okay, from the moment you open a given sphere, you will feel the energy around you constantly, because what's happened is that you've opened up this dormant center, and then it's basically let a load of that energy free that has been previously stuck and condensed within one part of your nervous system, that has basically been restricting that energy and maintaining that given identity structure. So each stage of the initiation process basically involves cutting through a load of illusions, a load of shells, basically cutting through your identity structures to then tap into who you are underneath that. When you're cutting through those identity structures, a lot comes to the surface. Sometimes so much comes to the surface to the point where it's very difficult to actually know what to do with yourself. Now, when that happens, a lot of people sort of fall backwards into their false self, which means that many people get caught in the illusions of what they are trying to break out of. This is because when you're going into your shadow self and you're going into yourself on this level, your false self is not going to, basically, it's not going to not put up a fight. You know, as you go through this initiatory process, there are going to be phases whereby you are in resistance without you actually realizing it. And when you're in resistance in this process, you're not doing anything wrong. In a lot of ways, the resistance is a natural part of the process, as long as you are able to recognize it eventually and ultimately take accountability for where you are within the process. Okay, the issue that many people run into is that they start to cut through these Qliphothic spheres and cut through. Basically what they're doing is cutting through their own identity. They experience the dissolution, and then instead of surrendering to the process, they basically sort of treat everything that they are experiencing as truth. Okay, and it can feel like that, when you're going through that initiatory process, it can feel like everything that you're feeling here is true. But many neglect to fully understand that when you're initiating into a Qliphothic sphere, you're cutting through a load of illusions. You're cutting through a load of unprocessed desires and impulses that have been previously repressed. So what will happen is that a load of these emotions and feelings will come to the surface, often somatically and often through the world around you, to get you to basically look at these different aspects of yourself and transmute them. Whereas what many people do is that they get caught in the illusion and then don't want to move forward, okay? And they basically end up moving from sphere to sphere to sphere, not actually integrating what's coming up in that sphere, and then it all catches up with them eventually. Okay, so the Qliphothic initiation process is highly intense, is extremely psychological, but also very in the body as well. Okay, and it's important that you really give yourself the space to be able to really ground and fully integrate the energies that you're tapping into. Otherwise, the consequences are going to be dire. Okay, the consequences of not grounding and integrating this energy effectively causes people to get stuck within the delusions of the Qliphothic spheres, causes people to get stuck within the illusions of grandeur that the Qliphothic process is trying to get them to break out of. So it's important that we discuss these common mistakes that is very, very easy to run into as you go through your Qliphothic initiation process, so that you know what to look for within yourself, so that you can ultimately do something about it when you're going through the process. Okay, so understand that this is also highly subjective. So I've got a few mistakes listed here. Mistake number one, okay, that I see this playing out a lot, is moving too quickly through the process. Okay, so what often happens with people who go into the Qliphoth is that they often claim that they've polished it off within 6 months to a year. And then I ask the question, so you've been through all 10 Qliphothic spheres and Darth and every one of the 22 tunnels of Set within the space of 6 months. And then I sort of think, I don't think so. Okay, it's not possible to go through the initiatory process that quickly and ground all of those energies, particularly when we're referring to the higher Qliphothic spheres, you know, past the abyss or the abyss and beyond, and, you know, the tunnels of Set as well, which are just pure void energy. So, you know, many people do move through the Qliphothic spheres very quickly, and sometimes the initiatory process is not always tangible, okay? There are some spheres that do have a very strong energy, but there are also some spheres that do also have a very sort of weak energy, not weak, but subtle, okay? For example, Thagirion, which is the middle sphere, for me came through very, very subtly. It was a very subtle but extremely dissolving initiatory process. So a lot of the time in the Qliphothic process, it's not always clear what exactly is being processed and what is being dissolved. And sometimes what can happen when the process gets uncomfortable is that the false self wants to escape where it is unconsciously. So then it says to itself, I'm done in this Qliphothic sphere, and then moves to the next one. Okay, and it kind of becomes a race, you know, with themselves or against themselves to kind of get to the next sphere and absorb the energy and then move on. It's important to really take your time within each stage of the initiatory process. When you open a Qliphothic sphere, what you will find is that very much from the moment of entering that sphere, you will be in the energy. And in my experience, it's a very progressive energy that can often come in waves as well. So what you'll find when you ritually open a Qliphothic sphere is that the energy will come into you and the overall intensity will massively ramp up, okay? And then it will peak. And then once you've really processed and integrated, then the intensity of the sphere will gradually wean off. And then you'll kind of feel yourself coming back to, you know, coming back into your body. And that is a sign of when to move on. You do not move on to the next Qliphothic sphere when you are still in the midst of the initiatory trials of the previous sphere. It's just plain stupid, to be honest with you, because you're still processing the energies of one, and then you're opening the other sphere and you're bringing that Qliphothic energy into you. And that basically means that now you're basically undergoing two initiatory processes in one go. Okay, I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong. There's not really a common guideline for it, but you know, it is very important in my view to really take your time through this process and spend, you know, have a guideline of at least a month within each sphere, but also play it by ear as you go. Always use divination to sort of, see if you're actually ready to move on to the next sphere. And obviously, if you're still, extremely ungrounded and you're still, got the Qliphothic energy booming through your system, then you're probably not ready to move to the next sphere. So acknowledge the fact that when you move into one sphere, there is going to be a process that unfolds that, increases the overall intensity of the sphere. And then as you integrate it, it will gradually come down. And a sign that you have integrated a Qliphothic sphere is when you feel more grounded in yourself. But don't be fooled by the grounded feelings either, okay? That is a sign, yes, but sometimes the initiatory process is still unfolding within your subconscious mind in a way that you can't actually consciously detect. So it's important to always use your divination to make sure that you are, moving on in a way that actually works for you. Otherwise, what happens is that, yes, you can go through and initiate all of the Qliphothic spheres. You can open every single Qliphothic sphere in one night if you want to. But what will unfold after doing that, I cannot say. So unless you have fully integrated it and, before moving on, if you go into the next sphere sort of with the energy still unintegrated, then basically what's going to happen is that you're going to have two initiatory processes unfolding at the same time, and then that is what can cause stress within the nervous system. And this is when like the physical body can start to respond, in certain ways. Like I've had it a few times in my Qliphothic process, not rushing through the process. I don't really rush through it. I always make sure that I'm grounded before moving on. But sometimes, even without rushing through the process, there can be so much that comes to the surface to the point where the conscious mind almost can't, comprehend what's actually going on, and then the body responds to it, whether it's like a lymph node popping up for a few weeks, or something manifests in the body like a cold or flu-like symptoms or things like that to sort of aid with the transmutation. So your physical body can respond in very interesting ways if the energies that you're tapping into are struggling to be grounded and integrated. Okay, and sometimes what people do is that they just try and get through it as soon as possible, get to Thalmael, and that's it. But again, what's going to unfold after that, I can't say. But all I can say is that the initiatory processes that do unfold after are going to be way more intense and much more dissolving. And unless you've really taken the time within each sphere to really ground and integrate before moving on, then it's very easy for that to build up within the unconscious mind. Okay, so not moving too quickly is important because it will catch up with you eventually. There is, for everybody, I think, from what I've seen, myself included, there is one point in the process that is, not necessarily one specific point for everybody, but I think, for everyone, there is one point in the process that really, basically just puts you on your ass, basically. There's one process, there's always one point in the process at least that completely stops you in your tracks and causes you to completely retrack yourself, okay? For me, that was Satariel, okay? Going through Satariel completely retracked. My body was responding in very extreme ways to what was going on, and it was so extremely disorientating to the point where, my mind felt ready to move on to Gagiel, but my body was still catching up with it. Okay, so even though I really was like, I really want to go, like Gagiel is waiting for me, and the stuff that is coming up is so resonant with Gagiel, there was like, my body was still catching up. Okay, and that particular point in the process of Tariel was a big perceptual shift that really stopped me in my tracks and forced me into a place of being a lot more present with my emotions. So not moving too quickly is essential, and it is a mistake that a lot of people make. I've seen it. So on the subject of presence, the next mistake is lack of presence and stillness. Okay, so there's a lot of talk within the occult community around, the Qliphothic work, and it is misunderstood. Okay, there's not many people who speak about the Qliphoth from a trauma-informed perspective. Okay, there's literally like one other person that I know on YouTube who genuinely talks about it from a trauma-informed space. And, generally speaking, it's misunderstood. And a lot of people go into it, as a subconscious punishment, so they're not really exercising any presence with themselves. They just want to move and get through it and things like that. But really, the Qliphoth is so somatic that it really requires you to come back into your body and really take time, to yourself and in stillness, to rest and ground the energies, and also to really kind of, actually sit and feel your emotions. This is the thing. The Qliphoth is about teaching you how to use your emotions and use them effectively. Okay. And using your emotions effectively does not mean suppressing, and it doesn't even mean controlling your emotions. But it means actually letting yourself feel your emotions with enthusiasm, and that means that you do have to take time. In my personal process, taking that time each day to really be in stillness. If there's emotions that there's protective parts that are stopping from actually coming through, then take time, put on like a song or a movie that triggers that kind of energy, and really just allow yourself to really feel and process it. The Qliphoth really does require presence and stillness to really be able to sort of process, alchemize, and ultimately ground the energies that you're tapping into. And many people just go invocation after invocation after invocation and just, keep tapping into all of these different energies. And, basically what they're doing is that they're just bringing all of this Qliphothic energy into their system. They're like more and more and more. And it is very intoxicating. It is, it's extremely intoxicating, and it can be quite addictive, in many ways. But unless, we're actually taking that time without doing any invocations to actually sit, ground, and integrate, then, the Qliphothic energy builds up within the system. And it's basically much harder. Many people actually paradoxically avoid their trauma by, say, going into a spirit invocation or doing similar. So it's important to really realize that presence and stillness is often more powerful than, more invocations or tapping into more energies. If you're already feeling the Qliphothic energy strongly and you're already, you've already got lots coming up, you've got to ask yourself, do I need to do another invocation now? Do I need to, do anything else that is going to basically paradoxically make me escape where I am now? Because it is all about feeling and embracing your emotions and actually learning how to use them, presence and stillness, and really taking that time each day to tune in with yourself and, sit in silence and be present with yourself, then it's absolutely essential, to be able to process and ground the energy. So many people just go in and just bulldoze through everything, and without actually taking that time in stillness. And all you have to do is observe the energy of people who claim to have gone through and grounded everything, and you see that there's a lot of unintegrated energy within the fields of many occult practitioners. There's not, don't get me wrong, it's not everybody. There are some very good practitioners out there that are very good at grounding the energies, but I would say the vast majority of practitioners out there do not ground these energies, and get caught in the falsehood that is about going into the Qliphoth and I'm on the left-hand path, and I'm on the path of self-deification. Um, when in reality, the real medicine is presence and stillness and letting yourself really feel and process your emotions effectively. So that's a very big mistake that I see everybody making to some extent that I'm mentoring, is, bypassing and kind of, trying to escape somewhat where you are. Presence and stillness is absolutely essential to be able to ground the energies that you are tapping into with the Qliphothic realms. Okay. The next one is lack of gentleness. Okay, so with the Qliphoth, you're doing work that is very much here to reconnect you to your soul. Okay, the soul parts that are repressed within the unconscious, that are repressed within your nervous system. What this basically is are, well, they're pieces of your inner child. Yeah, they're pieces of your inner child, pieces of your innocence that you're basically learning to welcome back into your body. And people approach this path with so much aggression and a lot of unprocessed anger and rage. Okay, many people are still holding on to, say, anger with the patriarchal system, or angry with the trauma that they are holding on to, and then they're going into it with aggression, but really, I've seen many people go into it and completely sort of force their inner child into what is realistically a very scary place. So the Qliphoth requires gentleness. It requires, that gentleness with yourself. And as you go through each initiatory process, taking that time to hold yourself and communicate with yourself effectively, taking that time to really, sit with your inner child and actually communicate with your inner child, not just, assuming what the inner child wants, because then you're responding in the same way that likely your parents did to you, and if you're, very much approaching the Qliphoth like, yes, come on, go, move, 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 then, you've got to look at what's happening to the innocence inside. Yes, the outer layer is I'm ready to do the work, I'm doing the shadow work, but when you really look inside, you've got to be honest with yourself and say, where are you repressing your own innocence? Where are you forcing your inner child into places that it may not actually be ready to go into? So, a very, very common mistake is a lack of gentleness. People go in and they're being aggressive with themselves. Okay. Many people, I think, do go into the Qliphoth because they've learnt that light is not safe. And then they fall into nihilism and actually end up using these chaotic energies as a form of self-harm, and I feel that is extremely, extremely common, within these Qliphothic realms. So, it's very important to very much be gentle with yourself and really nurture yourself through the process, because at the end of the day, the Qliphoth is a reparenting technology. Okay, if we look at it from a self-development perspective, you're reparenting yourself to actually feel safe within your power and feel safe within your own divinity, because these soul parts in your divinity has been repressed for a reason, because you've grown up in a world whereby it's not safe to really feel, embody it, and realistically fully embrace it. So this means that, you really need to not re-traumatize yourself going into that process, because if you're responding in exactly the same way towards yourself that your parents did to you, in terms of like, okay, you're going in and then it's like, oh, I'm still feeling this emotion. So then you're gaslighting yourself for feeling that emotion, because you were gaslit as a child, or, you're forcing your inner child into like, you should be here by this point, when in reality all your inner child really wants is to be held and nurtured. So really acknowledge that re-traumatization happens when you are experiencing the same things over and over again that are resonant with the trauma that you've experienced, and that can happen very easily internally by responding to your inner child in the exact same way that your parents did to you through your Qliphothic process. Acknowledge that real integration happens through gentleness and through nurturing, by giving your inner child the opposite to what was actually experienced when you were in your childhood. Okay, and many people neglect to really see and acknowledge the connection between the Qliphoth and the inner child. Okay, at the end of the day, you're going through this process and liberating your inner child. So if you're going into it, almost from a perspective of masochism or even sadism, which, a lot of people do end up doing, then, it's very easy to re-traumatize yourself as a result of that, because you are not actually giving your inner child the opposite to what was experienced. You're just going in and responding to them in the exact same way. So acknowledge that everything that you feel within the Qliphothic initiation process is valid. Every fear that you experience is valid. Okay, you go into it and you experience fear. Some people just come, oh, I shouldn't be experiencing fear, get rid of the fear. Yeah, and then you're gaslighting yourself for feeling the fear. It's like, oh, you shouldn't be feeling this anymore. You're at this point in your process now, or you shouldn't be feeling that. Or it's like, I'm in resistance, and then the concept of feeling in resistance then creates a loop, a thought loop. It's like, I'm in resistance, oh no, I'm failing my Qliphothic initiation process, and then the lack of gentleness just becomes a huge perpetual cycle. Okay, and it's very, very common. So, just be aware of how you're communicating with yourself. Is there any kind of self-hate going on within these realms? Are you, seeing the daemons as punishers? Are you, projecting that onto the world around you? Are you projecting that onto the spirits? Just acknowledge that everything that you experience within these realms is completely valid, because the further up that tree you go and beyond, the deeper you're going to go and the more you're going to realize about yourself, and the more impulses and mistakes and things are going to come to the surface that you were not previously aware of about yourself. So you've got to be willing to really sit and process that fully. and really nurture yourself through it and really be like, look, it's okay, I'm here with you and we'll do this together. Likely for many people who go into this process, that in itself is the opposite to what happened as a child. Okay, so really giving yourself that time to practice gentleness and be gentle with yourself and giving yourself rest when you need it is absolutely essential when going into these realms. I talk about this one a lot. Righteousness. This is one of the biggest curses upon oneself that can unfold within the Qliphothic realms. The Qliphoth often tests you through illusions of grandeur. Okay, there's a lot of, I think every sphere has some sort of illusion of grandeur that it tests you through. Okay, every sphere is going to challenge you in ways that are different and are going to basically appear as a different threat to your false self. And what this basically means is that you're going to encounter a set of trials that are, going to either help you break out of the illusion of grandeur, or you are going to not actually process and integrate that trial, and then you're going to fall further into that illusion of grandeur. And this is what I mean about getting stuck in the illusion of the Qliphoth, okay? What you're doing with the Qliphoth is that you're actually going through and you're breaking the shells of righteousness, which means that you're breaking your solidified identity structure that is actually imprisoning your own divinity. So what the Qliphoth is actually trying to initiate you out of is righteousness. How it plays out is often people get through the process and then their false self jumps on how far they've come in that process. Okay, and people get extremely ahead of themselves, particularly when they reach the supernal triad. They've crossed the Da'ath, good stuff, but all I can say is that they don't know what's ahead of them. So you have to understand that, yes, it's good to congratulate yourself and acknowledge how far that you've come, particularly by the time you get to the supernal triad. You've done a lot of, if you've processed and integrated, you've done a lot of work on yourself that is worth being proud of. But what I've seen with many people, particularly when they get to Thalmael, is that they get caught in the illusion of Thalmael. Yeah, and Thalmael is seen as a big, it is in a way, it's a celebratory process and experience because of what you've just been through. But there's also hidden trials within Thalmael, which is the top sphere in itself. Okay, yes, in Thalmael, you are given the crown of Lucifer. Okay, you are given the throne, but you've got to understand that once you attain the throne, you've then got to actually learn how to run your kingdom effectively and not drive it into the ground. So it's important to realize that, when you get to a certain point in the process, you have to congratulate yourself, but don't congratulate yourself too much. Acknowledge that righteousness can very easily build, and this is what causes people to get stuck in the Qliphothic shell, okay? And they're not actually tapping into the divinity that's underneath, which is accepting what it is that you don't know, but instead, they're stuck in this place of righteousness, of I've been through this is what I've been through, oh, I've already attained this, I'm now a deified consciousness. And then it can fall into more, direct delusions, whereby people can carry forward conspiracy theories. People can then start saying stuff like, I'm an incarnation of Lucifer, or, I'm an incarnation of this spirit, or like, I run the Qliphoth, or I'm an incarnation of Hecate. All of these things, can unfold through extreme delusion. And, when people get stuck in righteousness and they attach to what's been attained and they're not willing to continue doing the inner work that is required to actually resurrect your primal essence, which is your draconian essence, which is who you were before everything. If you're not willing to keep doing that deeper work, it's very easy to get caught in what you have attained. Okay, and many people get to Thalmael and it's like, okay, I've done it. It's amazing. I've done this big deified process, and then are completely dismantled by what happens after, because they then get stuck in that righteousness and stuck in that illusion and then can't move beyond it. And that is getting stuck within the Qliphothic shells. That is getting stuck within the very things that your primal essence is trying to break you out of. So righteousness is a self curse, within the Qliphothic realms. It is a self, cursing aspect of you that, wants to hold on to what has been attained. And that's when delusions can unfold. This is where people, not necessarily going into a mental asylum, but they end up carrying these delusions, forward, and it's not grounded at all in any way, shape, or form. And in my experience, this doesn't happen necessarily within the Qliphothic tree itself, but often happens after. Yeah, when people hold on to the glory and are not willing to let go of the glory of actually completing the Qliphothic tree, and then they're not aware of what actually unfolds after. Don't get me wrong, there are many people who are doing this work effectively, but there are many people who get stuck in that righteousness and do not want to move forward. And that is extremely dangerous, and that is when you will fall into Qliphothic delusions. Okay, and Qliphothic delusions are not fun because you're basically stuck in that sort of limbo space in just escrow between who you were, and you're just caught in this space because you don't want to let go of where you are. Okay, and then it's just a constant loop. So righteousness, massive mistake, extremely common and potentially detrimental if it goes unchecked. Qliphothic projection. Okay, projection onto others. This can happen a lot as well within the Qliphothic realms. So the reason for this is because your false self is greatly threatened by going through this process. Okay, it's greatly threatened. And what can happen is that it's a little bit like a coiled snake. Okay, in the world of shamanism, there's a form of medicine called serpent medicine, which is an energetic medicine that when you step into it, you're dealing with all your projections. And the symbolism here is that the snake just has to feel its way through reality, but when it gets backed into a corner, it feels threatened, so then it starts sort of lashing out at those around it. Okay, and this can very easily unfold within the Qliphothic realms. We can very easily, fall into that space whereby we make our problem the world's problem. Okay, and we project our problems onto the world, and we project our problems onto those around us, and worse, project them onto the spirits that are trying to initiate us beyond that particular problem. So Qliphothic projection is very common and is very easy when you're in certain stages of initiation that are extremely disorientating. Okay, where is the ego most threatened within the Qliphoth? For me, absolutely within the Da'ath and within Satariel. Okay, they kind of merge together, those two initiations. So, because you're going through an annihilation within the Da'ath, your false self in many cases may be trying to hold on without you realizing it. And then, what can happen is that delusions can form that then, you might get paranoid. You might get paranoid of those around you. And all of this is a sign of, the dissolving process happening. But if you're not aware of what's going on, then it can be very easy to just sort of keep blaming and keep projecting outwards without you actually realizing it. So Qliphothic projection happens when you don't actually, when your ego is threatened by the initiatory process you're going through, and it's trying to refuse accountability because it doesn't want to look at itself. Okay, and it can't handle the dissolving process that is happening. So Qliphothic projection is also a big one to be aware of. This is a big one as well that often slips through the cracks. Seeking clarity. The Qliphoth is not a path of clarity. It's a path of following the heart. And following the heart is basically acknowledging that you are not seeing things that are directly ahead of you. There's stages of the Qliphoth which are specifically designed to shatter illusions of clarity and false light and force you into a place whereby you have to see, within the dark, i.e. Satariel. Yeah, so when you're going through these types of initiatory processes, you have to let go of the need to know. After the abyss, there's, in my view, you just become more comfortable with not knowing things and more comfortable with the fact that a lot of clarity is an illusion, and clarity that we feel here and now is likely going to change the next day. Yeah, we may feel a wave of clarity, but it's tomorrow it will be different. And when you're going through the Qliphoth, you are a different person every day. Yeah, every time you sort of, go through a big initiatory process as you're moving through this tree, every day you're going to be changing. Every day you're going to change significantly as a person in a way that you're not necessarily going to fully understand. And as you're changing and changing and changing, it's important to realize that getting stuck within a space of clarity is often a common pitfall for people because they're not aware that they are changing so much. So then they're going into the Qliphoth seeking clarity. Okay, and the Qliphoth is not going to give you set clarity. The Qliphoth, if you go with the initiatory process, is going to give you massive bouts of illumination, death and rebirth at its finest, and it is going to deify your being. It does what it says on the tin. But connecting to the heart means getting rid of the senses, the illusionary senses that you think actually define who you are. Okay, so shattering the illusions of, defining self-worth by seeking and really letting yourself receive. Okay, this is the thing with the Qliphoth. It has the role of shifting you back to your primal essence, which is the black hole archetype. It's the great receiver. Okay, and when you go through an initiation like the Da'ath, a big sort of reversal of your field happens, whereby how you function as a being that is then carried on by the later stages of initiation, but how you function as a being, as a spirit, as an intelligence, as a human being, changes. It changes from seeking in a patriarchal system to receiving. And receiving means shattering the illusions of having to know what the next step is. Okay, and if you try and seek a next step whilst in the void, that's when the void becomes a labyrinth. The void is pure potential if you are willing to embrace it for what it actually is, and that is fresh soil. Okay, once you've gone through dissolving, you're not going to realize what's underneath because it hasn't grown yet. Okay, it's still being held in the incubation phase. So once you go through the dissolving of the Qliphoth, particularly after the Da'ath, from the Da'ath and onwards, you're fresh soil, completely fertile soil. Yeah, and this is the real challenge. Once all of that has dissolved, now you have to let whatever needs to grow, whatever wants to grow according to your true will, grow within your life and let yourself receive it instead of seeking it outside of yourself. And this is a tough initiatory process to go through because it shatters the illusion of clarity and shows you the illusion of knowing altogether. So seeking clarity within the Qliphothic realms is not a good idea because you're going into dark matter realms and are being initiated further and further into void consciousness. So then needing to know exactly what the next stage of your journey is going to be, you need to let go of that before you reach the end of the tree. Okay, you need to let go of that need to know and embrace the formlessness that comes from being a void consciousness. Very important. The last point I've got here is one of the most important and also one of the most bypassed and is the most difficult mistake I feel to actually track and become aware of. And that is the embodiment of separation instead of vulnerability. Very, very common mistake within the Qliphoth. What do I mean by that? So when we're working with daemonic metamorphosis, we're working with forces that perceive themselves as separate, which means that when we're tapping into them, it's easy to fall into the nihilism of separation, okay, without realizing that the purpose of going through this initiatory process is to transmute the illusion and actually integrate the pure awareness and the beast within you. Okay, it's to integrate your primal essence, but in doing so, you are integrating what that primal essence is, which is a personification of everything that has been denied. And on a psychological level, that is what daemons are. Okay, the initiators of these Qliphothic spheres are personifications of things that have been left unprocessed within yourself. So when you're integrating them, the idea is that you're not becoming more separate, but you're actually becoming more vulnerable. That is a sign of integration, when you are becoming more open and more vulnerable. Within the Qliphoth, you will face numerous crossroads. Crossroads that basically bring you situations whereby you can either feed separation or become more vulnerable. And understand that becoming more vulnerable is always going to be the harder option. And understand that one is not always clear. It's not always clear that that's happening, but acknowledge that the Qliphoth is there to make you more vulnerable as a person. And it's not unusual, say, that like within the Qliphoth, you're pulled, say, if you're not already within a relationship, pulled, say, romantic partners, or, pulled partners that are there to kind of, reflect things back to you. The Qliphothic initiation takes place through other people and often through the world around you, for one core reason, and that's because the false self is not able to look at itself. The demiurge, the false god in Gnosticism, is the blind god. It can't see anything past itself. So what it basically needs to be able to flesh out the transmutation is other people. Okay, this doesn't mean that if you're going through, say, a breakup within the Qliphothic tree, doesn't mean that you're in the wrong for going through the breakup. Okay, everything is relative and highly personal, but you have to acknowledge that the Qliphoth is there to reconnect you to your true essence, which means that you have to be more vulnerable with yourself. What many people do within the Qliphothic realms is that they choose separation over vulnerability. And this is very common when you're working with primarily chaotic forces like demonic spirits, because you are becoming more like them the more you invoke the intelligence. And if you're not integrating it, then you become more of an avatar for this energy as opposed to a conduit through the energy. And when I say avatar for the energy, I mean you're kind of becoming an embodiment of it, of the unintegrated aspects of yourself. Okay, for example, somebody who has not integrated Lilith's openness, vulnerability, and sexual alchemy could be completely stuck within sex addiction and pornography. You know, somebody who gets stuck within Asmodeus could be completely stuck within their perversions and completely stuck within innocent rage that they're not processing or integrating. Somebody who gets stuck within Gug Shabla could be stuck in their addictions and impulses. Somebody who gets stuck in Satariel is somebody who continues to lie to themselves. Somebody who gets stuck in Thagirion is somebody who is basically getting stuck in the illusion of pretense. Somebody who gets stuck in Samael, they're getting stuck in their own pre-created prison. Somebody who gets stuck in a Rab Zarak is getting completely stuck in their coping mechanisms and don't want to move past it. So you've got to understand that each Qliphothic sphere has the role of breaking you out a layer of suppression, which means that you are basically freeing yourself. You're freeing yourself, but the goal of this is not to become more separated. The goal of this is to open your heart and become more vulnerable with the world around you and become more vulnerable with yourself. If you're going into the Qliphoth and you're becoming more closed off as a person, that is not a sign of integration, because that is a sign of re-traumatization. When you are becoming more closed off as a person, that is a sign that you have been re-traumatized. Okay, if you are opening your heart and actually becoming more open with those around you and more open and vulnerable with the world around you, and you're willing to actually open that heart and, you know, be optimally truthful with yourself and those around you, then that is a sign of integration. Okay, the soul wants vulnerability and it wants that openness. The ego and the false self want separation. Big mistake in the Qliphoth is to go in and then start perceiving yourself more and more separate from the world around you. Real integration happens through openness and vulnerability, not through separating yourself, okay? Not through avoiding accountability, because this is the thing. The real lessons come through those around you in the Qliphoth, because they are there to provoke you into really evoking the repressed energies in your system that you are realistically not able to tap into on your own. Okay, this is the thing. It's accepting the illusion of separation. You go into the Qliphoth to reintegrate these different parts. You don't go into the Qliphoth to feed separation, because doing so is going to re-traumatize you and make you more separated from your soul's essence. And it is very easy to fall into that. So acknowledge that the soul always wants vulnerability and the ego always wants separation. Okay, so when you are faced with those situations whereby you have a choice as to whether to be closed off or to be open and vulnerable, acknowledge that the option of being open and vulnerable is often going to be the more challenging option. Okay, so the most common mistake that I see and the most easily hidden and the hardest one to see is trying to actually separate yourself instead of becoming more vulnerable. Absolutely essential to understand. Okay, and those are the core mistakes that I've seen playing out. Okay, so let me just recap on what I said. Okay, moving too quickly, that's a given. If you move too quickly through the process, it's not going to end well. You're not going to integrate properly. Lack of presence and stillness, you need to be present and still with your emotions. Let yourself feel often that is better and more effective doing that every single day than doing consistent invocations to actually separate yourself from the feeling that you're wanting to feel. Lack of gentleness. The inner child needs gentleness and comforting in order to feel safe in the world. If you're going into it from a place of just continuously bulldozing and forcing your inner child into places that it doesn't actually want to be, then you are re-traumatizing yourself through a simple lack of gentleness. Righteousness. Okay, the biggest cause of Qliphothic delusion, people get caught in the shells, they get attached to their illusions of grandeur, and they're not willing to move forward, so then they just spiral in inessent delusions and karmic cycles without any hope of breaking them unless they take accountability. Projection onto others. Qliphothic projection comes in when the ego feels threatened. When the ego feels threatened, by default, it wants to project accountability onto the external world. Be careful of that. Seeking clarity. The Qliphoth is not a path of clarity. It's not going to give you clarity. It's going to make you more comfortable with seeing in the dark. And separation instead of vulnerability. The Qliphoth is about becoming more vulnerable, becoming more open to love, becoming more open to the real feelings that your inner child wants to feel. The Qliphoth is all about love. Love holds the Qliphoth together. Yeah, this is what's beyond, this is what is within the depths of the void, is pure love and vulnerability. It's only the illusions and the obligations of the external world that are represented by the Qliphothic shells that keep this truth encased. So acknowledge why you are going into the Qliphoth. Are you going into the Qliphoth because you don't see yourself as worthy of embodying light and embodying order and realistically feeling these very simple feelings that your inner child was taught is not safe to feel? Okay, absolutely essential to understand. But I think that's everything I needed to speak about in today's video. Definitely hit like and subscribe if this video was helpful to you. Definitely check out my membership programs, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.